Hello, hello. I am so thrilled to invite a fabulous person that we met several years ago. So I want Devin, if you can introduce yourself and talk about the job that you have right now. But this is, again, a powerful conversation that we're going to have around personalizing learning at both a district level, a national level, and thinking about the future of what we're hoping for the students. So good morning, Devin.
Good morning. So I'm Devin Vodicka. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Alt School, which is an education and technology public benefit outfit that is working to help make whole child personalized learning accessible for all learners. And I was previously the superintendent in Vista Unified School District, which is in San Diego County.
So, Devin, as you started to think about and imagine personalized learning at Vista Unified, let's talk about your superintendency role.
Mm-hmm.
At what point, how long ago did you start imagining that at the superintendent level? And how did you start building a level of support amongst your board, amongst parents, and most importantly, amongst staff and administrators?
Yeah, so I was hired in 2012 in Vista Unified, and just for context, Vista is about 25,000 students. It's a suburb of San Diego, a very diverse community, and it actually started with, as a new superintendent, I wanted to make sure that we had what I was calling a framework for the future. And in my mind, that framework included a vision, mission, values, goals, roles and responsibilities, and a plan. And we didn't have many of those elements at that time. And I had been through, as a principal, opening new schools where you basically had to outline a vision and then get people to opt into that kind of model. But I knew that it was most powerful if you can co-create or co-construct these important aspirational elements for a community. And so we spent about 6 months working collaboratively with staff and school leaders and community leaders and students on a very interactive process to outline the vision, the mission, and the values initially. And that really set the stage for what came next, because what emerged from the community input was that we wanted Vista to be the model of educational excellence and innovation. And so when I reflect back on that, wanting to be the model of educational excellence is something that most districts, I think, try to have high expectations and high performance orientation. But what was new about it was this idea that we also wanted to be the model of innovation, which I felt was unique in public education. And our systems, our structures are not really designed to be innovative. And so it was that vision, though, that really compelled us to be creative as we went through setting the goals, establishing the roles and responsibilities, and then ultimately developing our plan with this orientation to innovation in the way that we would serve our students.
So what were one or two key roles, when you're reflecting back on it, that you did to continue to push you into this idea of innovation?
So there were a couple of key things that happened. So one was when we got into the goals, if you measure things in a very constrained way, you're likely to end up with a system that's oriented to a very narrow set of outcomes, which is then going to reduce the field of innovation. So one of the important things that we did was we established many metrics that the board would pay attention to, reflecting the mission and the values, focusing on things like collaboration and student engagement, real world problem solving. And so that was an important step. And then when we got into the roles and responsibilities, I felt like if we wanted to be the model of educational excellence and innovation, I needed one team that was focused on educational excellence and another team focused on innovation, because my experience as a school leader was that there's so many things that need to occur on a daily basis that if you don't carve out the time and space to be forward thinking and to push for something new and different, it just won't happen. And so we created a department, which was initially called the Innovation and Information Department. And then over time, people just shortened it to the Innovation Department. But that was the group that really then took the lead on determining how we were going to embrace innovation in a school district. And one of the real critical moments in this process was as we got into the planning stage, we did a series of student forums, and listening to the student input really compelled us to think about ways to make learning more relevant and meaningful for our learners, how to give them more choice, how to give them more agency in their learning. And that's what led us to create a plan that really promoted, we called it personal learning at the time, because we wanted learning to feel like it was owned by the student. And so I think it's that alignment, though, of the vision, the mission, the values, the goals, the roles and responsibilities, and the plan that really set the stage for some significant movement in what students experienced on a daily basis.
So as you were playing that out,
when you think about that idea, I just want to ask one question. When you think about that idea of innovation, of course, you were prescient in the fact that you imagined the next buzzword before it became the buzzword. So that's very important, because you tied together what I think a lot of people struggle with. But I'm curious in the sense of saying, so the idea that you made a space for innovation to live so that it could actually generate and develop, while at the same time you had a space for business as usual, meaning that the curriculum and the instruction that was taking place continued to move forward with the students. So that seems like it's an ideal balance until such point where perhaps one needs to overtake the other. Can you just reflect on that for a moment? Yeah,
so I think you hit on a key point there, which is that these two orientations of kind of a continuous improvement and a transformational orientation, they collide at a certain point in a classroom or at a school or in terms of the student experience. And this is where having clarity around where we're going, why we're here, how do we make decisions, how do we treat one another? These are the vision, the mission, the values. And then also, how do we measure progress? That becomes the decision-making criteria to decide when you tip one way or another. Because I think it's important to also point out, you don't just innovate to innovate. You do it to achieve a particular goal or outcome. And so where we saw that this new innovative approach was leading to fundamentally better outcomes, that's where we tipped over and said, all right, now we've reached a point where we have enough confidence that this new model is what we need to leap to more broadly. And I think without having that alignment in terms of that framework for the future, you could find yourself in a situation where you just have internal conflict between these two competing views of moving forward.
So I know that a fair bit of folks had to have been skeptical, both at the local level, and that's what we hear all the time. So how do we know that, because personalizing takes a significant amount of heavy lifting to shape the mission, the vision, the values, the goals, to get that right, to start transforming what instructional practice looks like. How do we know it works? How did you start tackling that in the local schools as part of Vista Unified?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is we used an early adopter model. So we asked people to opt in, and we had 29 schools. Initially, we had a critical mass at 5 of our schools to give this a shot. And we again looked at multiple metrics to see, to gauge our progress moving forward. And what we saw initially is, as we started, and actually I should step back a little bit, there was another stage of this where after we had the framework for the future together and we said we wanted to do personal learning, we then had to slow down and spend time building a common definition of personal learning, because there's a lot of misconceptions around what it is. Some people think it's putting kids in front of a screen and having them do worksheets, digital worksheets all day. And that was not in alignment with our idea of what we wanted to see. We wanted it to be meaningful work grounded in real world problem solving. Highly collaborative was what we were looking to do. So we spent almost a year with a broad group of community stakeholders coming up with our own definition drawn from resources like Education Reimagined, and Microsoft or Gates had some great resources we used. And we combined them into something that was meaningful for us. So once we had that framework and the metrics, we then asked people to opt in and try it and see what happened. And because it was opt-in and 5 schools out of 29, it mitigated the risk to some extent. And what we saw, interestingly, was what I would call the engagement metrics shot up rapidly. So attendance improved. We had fewer discipline problems. We surveyed the students and found that their attitudes about learning dramatically improved rapidly. And at the same time, our academic outcomes actually got worse for a very short period of time.
Right.
But we were looking at this holistically and had this feeling that if students came to school more often, they were more engaged in their learning and they were more enthusiastic and engaged in it, that ultimately that would translate to better academic outcomes. And sure enough, that's what happened. We persevered through that implementation dip, and then our academic outcomes shot up to levels that we hadn't seen before.
And Devin, how long was that implementation dip? Because I think a lot of superintendents are leaning in and saying, wait a minute. So yeah. How long do we have to wait until something turns around?
So we saw a little bit of variation, but the longest that we saw that dip was about a year. So sometimes it was 3 months, sometimes it was 6 months, sometimes 9 months. On the tail end of it, it was about a year. And what was great about it was we saw this pattern repeat itself often enough that when we expanded from 5 schools to the next wave of more schools and then more schools and more schools, we would celebrate these engagement improvements, because we knew that was a predictor of academic gains that would come within a short time. And so it just gave us a lot more confidence as we went through the change process, having seen this pattern play itself out over and over.
And before we talk about a national level, from a profile of a building principal, can you describe the kind of qualities that building principal should likely possess if they're starting to venture into this territory?
Mm-hmm. So we were really fortunate. We had an amazing team of principals that helped to lead this very challenging work. But I would describe it to them in this way. I would say there was a time when it was probably sufficient for a building principal to be like a plant manager and, make the bells ring on time and get people in the right place at the right time and manage your resources, and you were considered to be an effective principal. And then we added a whole set of responsibilities around instructional leadership. And we said it's not enough just to, manage the school. We actually want to see learning improve. And then in Vista, we added a third set of responsibilities, which is we want you to be a transformational change agent to reimagine what's possible for learners. And it's pretty rare that any one person is going to be masterful at all 3 of those areas. And so what we really looked for was someone who could build a team where, as a broader group, all three of those boxes would be checked, because you do need the school to be efficiently run. It needs to be safe. It needs to be well managed. We need the learning to continue to improve, and we need to be pushing the edges of what's possible, thinking about transformation. So that's the way I would, if I could find a perfect person who could do all of those things, that'd be amazing. But more likely it's someone who can build a team that can help us in each of those areas.
Lovely. All right, so let's talk about the national work and the how you started seeing personalizing show up as that brand new shiny penny
Mm-hmm.
about 2 or 3 years after you started doing the work at the district level, and
Mm-hmm.
your vantage point, because I know that you were able to go to Washington and be on a round table or two. So can you describe what you saw based on the district work and that national push?
Yeah. So there were a lot of interesting things that converged around this period of time. One was I was fortunate to be invited to be part of what they call the Superintendents Technical Working Group to help roll out President Obama's Connect Ed initiative, which initially was all around just high-speed broadband. And this group of superintendents, there were about 30 of us that engaged with the U.S. Department of Ed on this. We really pushed and said, it's not sufficient to have connectivity. You need connectivity so that you can change the learning experience. And, remarkably, the team there was very responsive to that input. And so what emerged was a federal program that was not just Connected, but also the Future Ready Schools. And that was done in partnership with the Alliance for Excellent Education. And that helped to set the stage for quite a few national conversations around, how do we create future-ready schools, and what does it mean to have a future-ready school system? And there are a lot of things that go into that. So we would get pulled into initiatives like Go Open around open educational resources. The maker movement was another strand in all of this, but there was certainly a lot of conversation with the U.S. Department of Ed around personalized learning. They had a cohort of schools through Race to the Top that had started to make some inroads with personalized learning, and so we got pulled into that group and ended up just benefiting tremendously from a broader national conversation around, how do we shift away from a teacher-centered model to a learner-centered approach, using this term personalized learning as a strategy to get there. And, that in combination with involvement in the League of Innovative Schools through Digital Promise gave me the feeling that this is really part of a much bigger movement, and that we were lucky in Vista that by being responsive to our community, by listening to our students, it had helped, pull us in this direction that seemed like a much bigger change effort across the whole country.
And as you're thinking about the national landscape, in addition to Vista Unified, can you name another few schools, private, public, that you feel that they're continuing to move in this direction? Because a lot of folks want to say, well, where can we look? Where can we see something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think there are pockets of innovation in almost any system. You can go into almost any school and you're going to find a couple of teachers that are doing some amazing things. Or you can go in any school setting and you're going to find a couple of schools that are farther on this journey than others. So I don't think it's isolated in any way, but I know one of our great partners was Vista Unified. Yes. Superintendent Tom Rooney and his team. We learned a great deal from them. They entered into this looking at it much more from a competency-based lens, which brought them down this path of personalized learning. And those two things, I think, are complementary, in a lot of ways. So that's a system doing some incredible work. I've also seen schools like Design 39 in Poway, which is really embracing this idea of a human-centered design model for teaching and learning. So there are some great examples of tremendous innovation in schools in many different places.
So what's the one caution or concern that you might share at a national conversation? Because I'm sure that as you started to see what other directions different communities were heading in, something that you take a look and say, you're not quite understanding it right, based on your early work to make it as human and humane as possible.
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception that I continue to run up against is there is a sentiment that personalized learning is computers replacing people, and that a personalized learning experience means a kid will sit in front of a screen all day and be taught by a robot. I think there is a role for technology in supporting meaningful personalization. I don't know how a teacher at a middle school or high school that sees almost 200 students in a day could manage learner variation and personalized learning tied to individual goals without some great tools to help them. But I also think it's a big mistake to conflate personalized learning with technology-driven learning, because I think that's not my view of what's best for kids in the future. I think that learning is a deeply social experience, and I think that there's a tremendous role for educators in this process, and those educators should be superpowered with powerful technology tools that help them to be even better. But some people get the sequence there wrong, and that just confuses the whole issue, because then we're talking about two completely different approaches to teaching and learning. And I think sometimes people combine them in a way that can be counterproductive.
Is there some way that you're thinking that this is sustainable beyond the moment? Like, how do you think about that for the future?
Yeah. So I am increasingly convinced that we have a system of teaching and learning that reflects an industrial approach. It was designed at the dawn of the industrial age, and it was basically set up to resemble factories with assembly line efficiency. And we are approaching a tipping point where we're going to move from a system of mass production to a system of mass personalization. And so moving from this industrial to a post-industrial paradigm will not only mean that mass personalization will become the norm, but it also means that we'll need new measures. We need to look at things much more holistically and be way more focused on social emotional learning, the habits and skills that will contribute to long-term success for students, and even more importantly, orienting to what I would call the meta competency for the future, which is learning how to learn. Because the dynamic environment that our learners are going to go into in this age of exponential change and artificial intelligence, creating entirely new and different ethical considerations, is going to require our kids to be lifelong learners in ways that are just so much more imperative than they may have been 50 years ago. And so this change is not only this change has to happen away from a teacher-centered or an efficient model to an effective model that's focused on learning and helping our kids to learn how to learn. That's what our kids need. That's what our communities need. It's what society will demand in the future. And I feel like it's just a question of time until we reach that tipping point.
So Devin, I know that you made a significant shift in your job description from being the superintendent to the work that you're doing in alt school. And so as you're thinking about the through line, is there whether it's a moral compass or a handful of values that really continue to stick with you as you're engaged in the work you're doing now?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that gave me great confidence to make a big change was to see so many commonalities between the approach in Vista Unified and at Alt School. Very much a student-centered, learner-centered approach in both places. Being responsive to the needs of learners and then determining how to really help them to drive their learning moving forward. The benefit, in both settings also, trying to be creative about using technology as a tool or a resource to accelerate the journey. And at Alt School, thinking about how to extend that impact on a much broader level was something that was very compelling. But you could look at the personalized learning model that we had in Vista, which we visualized as a 5-pointed star. And at Alt School, we have what we call learning conditions. There are 5 of them. They're basically the same 5. So
can you rattle them off, Devin?
Yeah, so it's a holistic learning profile is the foundation of each of them. It's using technology as an accelerator. It's learning path, which is the element of student choice. Flexible learning environments, which transcend the classroom, and then a competency-based model of students getting what they need when they need it and moving at their own rate. I'm combining language from each of the 2, but those are basically the 5 main points. The student needs to know who they are. That's part of that profile. And then they need to see themselves as being full of possibility, which is that idea of path. Yeah. So it's exciting, I think, to see this kind of convergence in very different settings, a Silicon Valley startup and a suburban school district. That tells me that just like I saw on a national level that this was part of a bigger movement. It tells me that there's some broader forces at work that we can be in service of, so that we can better support our kids.
Well, thank you so much, Devin, for taking the time to chat with us. And again, the level of insight that you have, and it's really unique to have that district view and national view, and also start to see the level of energy that's coming from not just places like Silicon Valley, but we're also starting to see that magic in the students. And I think if you can end with something that I know you and Matt Doyle, the assistant superintendent of innovation at Vista Unified, did. Can you tell quickly about the Wordle that you drafted?
The which one?
The Wordle.
Oh, yeah.
That's
yeah,
right.
sorry. I thought the Wordle. Yeah, so when I initially did the student forums, this is back as we were developing our plan. I did a couple of them, and they were very informative and very helpful. And every one that I did, I would ask the students at the end to write down one word that described their view of school. And then I would also ask the students, who else should I be talking to? And so we ended up doing about 60 of these forums in the course of a year, and getting input from, I think it was well over 1,000 students. And then I started out doing them solo, and then I brought Matt in as I went, because it was a big undertaking. And so at the end of it, Matt had this idea to take that one word and create a word cloud, a Wordle, to see what was the most common word that students use to describe school. And I asked in many settings, I say, what do you think they said? And the word that was most, the biggest word in the middle there was irrelevant, which is good and bad. It's good in that the students use some good academic language, but it was heartbreaking also to know that we had so many good people working so hard trying to meet the needs of students, and that in spite of our best efforts, the kids just really didn't see the point of it. And so it was that was the moment when both Matt and I said we cannot let that continue to be the student perception, which really led to us emphasizing this idea of personal learning moving forward. And if there's a big lesson in that for other leaders, it would be listen to your students. Find time to give them the space to share their insights and be responsive to their input, because it can open up incredible possibilities that you never imagined. And isn't that what we're here to do anyway, is to serve our kids and be responsive to learners? So empower their voice, be responsive to it, and watch and see what happens. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you so much, Devin. You are a real inspiration. And I'm glad you have continued to follow your North Star and just merged it and kept making it happen.
Well, I appreciate it. I've had tremendous partners along the way, and I'm thrilled to see so many great people doing amazing things for kids. And I certainly count each of you as key contributors in this broader movement to do a better job of serving our kids. So thanks for your hard work.